Well, any relationship with Jesus begins with grace. Grace, unmerited favor, a free gift from God. It's not something that we earn or we deserve. And this really is the central message of the best news that has ever been given to the world, that God so loved the world that he would give his one and only Son. And I want you to know that is news for today. That is still good news for right here, right now. For God so loved you, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what's been done to you. For God so loved you that he would send his Son Jesus. That he would give the gift of his Son Jesus. And through Jesus, the grace of God has been expressed. Through Jesus, the grace of God is now made available to everyone. And no matter what anybody may have ever told you before, God is for you, not against you. You see, there's some false misrepresentations of God out there, some things that people say about God that just aren't true. And sometimes these misrepresentations of God, they come out of a religious bent and this kind of religiosity that begins to look for some control. Because all of us, I think, in some way or another, feel out of control in our lives. And religion is another place where we can try to get some of that control back and define ourselves by it. And there's an attractiveness to religion. It's not good news at all. It's usually bad news. Religion is all about, who can you keep out? Religion is all about, who is better? Religion is about comparing and competing and all these things. Religion is all about us and our ability to get to God. And yet what God is continually doing is inviting us to receive a relationship that begins with grace, continues with grace, and any guesses what it's finished with? Grace. It's grace from beginning to end and everywhere in between. And so I want to encourage you, if you've not started a relationship with God or stepped into grace as grace is available to you, if you have, and maybe somewhere along the line, grace started to drift away and was beginning to be replaced by some rules and regulations or some things that you could do on your own strength or ability, well, it's time to step back into grace. And we see that grace will finish its work and will be made complete in us. When we encounter Jesus in this way, in a very grace-centric, grace-centered way, then we encounter the realness of who God is and his great love for us. We're in this message series called Wicca Wicca Turntables. And it's sometimes in the Gospel of Luke, the New Testament Gospel of Luke, where Jesus was having a meal with people and he turned the tables to help them see something in a new way. And so there are common ways that we view the world and we experience things. And what Jesus is constantly doing is allowing us to see the world through a new lens. But I want you to know that lens that he gives us is always the lens of grace. And so for us, he's constantly turning the tables. We get that little wicca wicca. And here we go. He's spinning it around. Our memory verse is found in Luke chapter 24, verse 45. I'd love for you to read this out loud. It's great to hear God's words coming out of your own mouth. Let's read this together. It says, "Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures." Then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. The thing about, religion and kind of taking the place of God and saying, no, I'm in control of this, is we can read the scriptures with the religious mindset, but that religious mindset would typically be a closed-minded mindset in the sense that it says, I've already got it figured out. I have all my answers. And so I'm turning to the scriptures to prove what I already think and believe and to support the view that I have. And yet what God is inviting us to do is to take on this lens of grace, and through this relationship with Jesus and this new identity that he gives us, he actually invites us to read the scriptures with him. And I think that's one of the most amazing things, is that God not only loves us so much that he would give us his son Jesus, and Jesus would come and die for us to make a way for us to be with him forever, but he is with us forever, and he gives us his Holy Spirit. And so when we read the scriptures with him, he opens our eyes. And he allows us to see things in a new way. And believe me when I tell you, there's some ways that we view our worlds. And when I talk about our worlds, I mean, we can certainly look at the big picture and, the global, world that we look at. And I guarantee you there's some ways that we need to rethink that and relook at it. For God so loved the world, everyone. And when we look at like our nation, there's some ways we need to relook at our nation, but let's bring it into our worlds, our community, our neighborhoods, our very houses, our family dynamics. When we take this lens of grace and we begin to meet with God and hear from him and to have our minds open to what God is doing, then grace begins to saturate everything. And God's love begins to not only pour into us, but now fill us to a measure of all fullness where he is what is coming out of us. And so as we think about Jesus and his ability to turn the tables, I want you to know that we'll discover a wrong, a right, and a turntables moment. Our wrong begins with religion. Religion is often wrong because religion tries to clean from the outside in. Religion is typically concerned with behavior modification. The idea of behavior modification goes like this: I'll change what I do and that will somehow change who I am. So if I can be a good little boy or girl, then that will make me a good little boy or girl. If I change my outside appearance, if I look clean on the outside, then that means I'm clean on the inside. And yet God is doing something different here. And so we come to our meal that Jesus is having in Luke chapter 11, beginning in verse 37. It says, when Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Then the Lord said to him, now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but on the inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything else will be clean to you. And so in this moment, here Jesus, he's been speaking and teaching, and a Pharisee. The word Pharisee, it refers to these experts in the Jewish law. And so the Old Testament has 600 and plus Old Testament commands. You may have heard of the 10 commandments, the big 10 that it starts with. But off those, there come over 600 commands that are revealed through the Old Testament that do reveal the holiness of God and help us understand who he is and who we are in relationship to him, and the massive gap that is in between us, our imperfection, lined up with his perfection. And the job of the Pharisees were to take these laws that were in the Old Testament and interpret them in a changing social dynamic and then apply them to the people and even enforce them. So you may notice that when you read the Bible or the New Testament and the Gospels, the stories of Jesus, Jesus was oftentimes eating at the house of a Pharisee, which I'm like all for it. Jesus liked to eat out. I like to eat out. That's a good thing. And these Pharisees oftentimes were hosting him. But the Pharisees did have some ulterior motives there, which aren't necessarily bad considering their job and their role. They were checking Jesus out. This guy's preaching and teaching, and crowds are gathering around him. And the Pharisees, these experts in the law, they had a responsibility for the people. And so they were checking Jesus out. What's he like? So they were watching him. What's he do? What's he say? Where does he go? Who is he with? And so Jesus now has been speaking, and one of the Pharisees invites him to have dinner at his house. So Jesus goes in, and Pharisee, the word actually means separated ones. So their whole identity was like, we're the clean ones, and we don't want to do anything that would make us unclean. And so their job as leaders in the worship, and religious leaders meant that they didn't want to do anything that would cause them to have any uncleanliness. And so they're super concerned about appearances and what the outside looked like. And so Jesus knows this full well. This is nothing new. This is certainly a cultural dynamic he was super familiar with, but it was one that comes with a lot of problems. When your religious leaders have power and authority and control and are really devoted to a system of interpreting and applying and enforcing the rules and regulations, you wind up with a controlling power structure that can be super abusive. And we certainly see this all the time in our world today. It's still a draw. It's still an attraction. There is something about religion that says, I can do this. I can control it. It's attractive in the sense of, in a religious system and construct, you kind of know how you're doing because you can compare yourself to other people. In this relationship with Jesus, where it's all grace all the time and it's unmerited favor, and I need grace just like you need grace, and it isn't like one of us needs grace more than the other needs grace. We all need grace exactly the same, totally and completely. Well, then it's really hard to be better than anybody. It's really hard to then have control over other people. It's really hard to have power over people. Now, this Pharisee's job was really tough, but they're watching Jesus really close, and he knows this, and he knows it's going to be an issue if he doesn't do the ceremonial washing. He doesn't wash his hands. So it's not like it caught him off guard. I figured Jesus was probably being pretty intentional about this. Yeah, I'll have dinner at your house. Let's eat. And here he is at the table, but the Pharisee was surprised that Jesus, this guy who's supposed to be this teacher, this rabbi, this religious leader in their system, isn't following their traditions that have now become their rules. He's breaking form here. Like in this guy's house, I mean, he might have even been like, well, this is kind of like rude and kind of disrespectful, and what are you doing? But now Jesus is going to address this. It says, then the Lord, referring to Jesus, said to him, now then you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. What Jesus is telling us is that, hey, here's what matters to God. What matters is what's on the inside. Now, the cool thing about the inside, and Jesus will address that as well, is when God transforms us on the inside, that will manifest itself outwardly. And we'll see some different behaviors, and we'll see love and grace, but it may not look like what the religious people think it should look like. In fact, generally speaking, I get pretty happy when people with a propensity towards religion and rules and regulation and control and power get upset with me and tell me, you're doing it wrong. Like, you guys are baptizing too many people, you're doing it wrong. You guys are loving people and welcoming people, you're doing it wrong. You guys aren't being as harsh, you're not yelling at people and screaming. You don't spit enough in your sermon. We don't have to have a splash zone, so we're doing it wrong. And that's great. That's good because, man, I want Jesus and his grace and his love and his good news. We want to share good news and good news ways and let people know what he is up to. And so this concern about the outward appearance and keeping everybody happy, it's also that controlling, it's really a poor leadership dynamic too. How do you keep everybody happy? How do you make sure you don't upset anybody? How do you keep up appearances? And wow, it's exhausting. And Jesus is like, man, you're so concerned about the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. And we all know how disappointing that can be. When you see something that looks really good, but then you get into it and you find out it's not good at all. This happens to me sometimes. Those cuties, those clementine, those delicious little orange things? I don't eat, candy and sugar. So for me, I see one of these and I don't go out and buy them, but I'll see one in a bowl somewhere and it's you can take one. I get kind of excited. I'm like, well, that'd be a tasty snack. And I'll grab one that looks really, really good. And then I stick my thumb in there because it's so fun. It's so super satisfying when you peel them all in one peel. You get the whole peel together, and it's then you can put it back together and pretend like it's a fruit again. But I've done this before. It's happened a few times. I've stuck my thumb in there and cracked it open, and it's just rotten on the inside. Well, it's a dirty trick. I get really mad at the fruit. How dare you, fruit, look so delicious and like a little ray of sunshine in the dead of New Hampshire winter, where I'm yes, I'm going to consume vitamin C and sunshine, and this is going to feel so good. But when I crack it open, it's just death. And that is what we find so often in these religious expressions and this judgment and this constant watching for people to fail and the examining everyone and trying to decide who's in and who's out and the meanness that ensues with it. And you come into contact with that and you stick your thumb in there and you crack that open and you just find more death when you've already got all the death you need. It looks good, but it's just so full of death. That's why it's no surprise that And people are done with religion. As I get to travel sometimes around the country and go different places and share about what God is doing in New England, people are really fascinated by it. It's kind of fun. They're like, really? Like, God's in New England? I thought New England kicked him out years ago. And there's these silly phrases that are like going around out there. Like people say that New England or even the United States is now a post-Christian culture. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody say something like that, but it's some language that gets used that it's a post-Christian culture. And I'm like, knock it off. There's no such thing. You can't be post-Christian. Jesus was, and he is, and he'll always be. He's the Alpha and the Omega. There is nothing post-Jesus. This is it. This is the answer. Now, what is exciting is that I do believe in many ways New England is a post-religious culture. And we're at the forefront of that movement in the United States. So I understand that. And that freaks out and it's kind of scary to religious leaders because they now feel threatened by that. But I want you to know, I think it's one of the best things that could ever happen for the Jesus movement. Is when religion is like, yeah, we're good with that. We don't need to crack open any more, these good-looking oranges and find more death. We've got enough death. What we need to do is we need to find something that's alive. And that's what we find in this relationship with Jesus. And so what's wrong is religion tries to clean from the outside in. But what's right is that Jesus cleans from the inside out. And so religion focuses on behavior modification. I change what I do, that changes who I am. When what Jesus focuses on is metamorphic transformation. And what metamorphic transformation means is he changes our core identity, and that new identity then moves out of us. Metamorphosis, it's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. And some of you have been in your cocoon for a while, so it's time to get out. There is this expression of a new identity that comes out of us. God puts his love inside of us as a gift, and it changes who we are, and then his love is expressed through us to others. And so as we keep reading, Jesus is going to use this word, woe. W-O-E, woe, like heads up, look out. You guys really need to listen to this. Woe. Verse 42, woe to you Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, because you're like unmarked graves, which people walk over without even knowing it. One of the experts in the law answered him, Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us. Jesus replied, Good. He didn't say that. He's like, good, you're getting in it. Jesus replied, he just keeps going. Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with heavy burdens that they can hardly carry, and you yourselves are not willing to lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because you built tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God has said in his wisdom, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that had been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. And so as Jesus addresses this Pharisee who's kind of all been out of shape, that Jesus didn't do the right thing in the right way at the right time, the way they were doing it, Jesus is like, hey, like there's a whole other thing here. What I've come to do is come to clean you from the inside out. And yet there is this pull towards legalism. Legalism is when, or really any ism, is a replacement for God. Anytime that, we're caught up in an ism, I would look for an idol to be there, some kind of God replacement, some other Lord in your life, some other identity piece that begins to define us, whatever ism we put there. Legalism is a super common one in religious circles where a legalistic person will, and I know this really well because I've personally done it and was super good at it, by the way, which is sad. What you do is you find your list of do's and don'ts. And whatever your do's and don'ts are, you just get a little checklist going. And I don't do these things. And people who do those things, well, they're not like me. And they're not, holy like me. And they don't love Jesus like me. So they're no good. So I'm better than them. And then I don't do these things. And so these people who do those things, well, my goodness, they're really awful too. And everybody kind of just makes their own little legalistic thing. And then, the other parts you make excuses for. And you kind of ignore them. And it's so deadly and so dangerous because all it is death. It's all death all the time. That's what it is. And so even when I tell people like, hey, God's not dead, but yeah, religion's dead. But you don't have to mourn it. That's okay. It was always dead. It doesn't bring life. What brings life is God brings life. He's the life giver. And he brings this life through relationship. And he provides relationship through Jesus. And he has made a wonderful way, a most glorious way, for us to have an identity change from the inside that moves out. And yet what happens is so often we start with grace, and then at some point it's like, okay, grace was good, but I'm feeling good, and I think I've got it. I think I'm doing really well, and so I'm going to take over. And oftentimes what happens is we take over for grace, and we step in front of grace, and that's where the legalism comes in, and we have our rules. And this is how we compare ourselves to others. But this legalism, it kills. It always does. So there's a few things that we can see in Jesus' woes to the Pharisees that are right there in the text. Legalism kills generosity. It's interesting, like he says, okay, woe to you Pharisees because you give God a tenth of your mint and rue and herbs and spices. In essence, what he's saying is like, you guys are so serious about the tithe and the legalistic tithe that you're tithing your spice racks. Like you're getting down to the nitty gritty here. And that's like a point of pride for them, that they were doing this. And he's saying, okay, you should, tithe, yes, go for it. But you want to understand that that's not what changes you. Let what God is doing in you and the new identity that he gives you be what changes you and propels that new identity. And so not neglect justice and the love of God. See, legalism kills because it replaces love with law. And instead of relying on God's grace and God's love, we start to rely on our ability to interpret, apply, and enforce God's law. And Jesus is like, I got a better way. So it kills generosity. We're not even experiencing true generosity anymore. Legalism kills humility. They looked for praise and recognition. They loved the seats of honor. They loved to be greeted in the marketplace. They loved their titles and the respect. Probably even in some ways, the power, the control can also, one of the easiest ways to control people is with fear. So you have that fear over them. And so when people fear you, like that's crazy. That's not cool. And it kills the love of God. And it kills humility in us. It kills community. It says Jesus told them they put heavy burdens on people and didn't even lift a finger to help them. So the application of these laws was like getting heavier and heavier. Like a simple thing like remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And they had all these rules around the Sabbath about how far you could walk and what you could do and where you could do it and for how long and all these things associated with it. And Jesus is like, man, like God made Sabbath for you, not you for the Sabbath. And so even a thing like Sabbath, which is meant to be rest and worship in the Lord, rest then became work. Worship is now a work, instead of just rejoicing and resting in what God has done. And it destroys the community because now there's so much work that has to be done and they're not helping each other because they're using it as a way to compare and to control. Legalism kills integrity. Jesus tells them, okay, you're building tombs for the prophets, but it was your ancestors who killed the prophets. And so it's like you're approving of that. And you're building these monuments, which again, there were costs associated with it and all the things that would go around this, but these monuments would then be used for this religious control. We see it all the time. the religious monuments and artifacts and the things that, this is it. This is like the focus of our worship. We do it a lot today with buildings. We get really hung up with them in our idea of church. Like, in fact, instead of referring to church as the people of God, the family of God, or a local church being a local community of believers, church just gets referred to as a building with a steeple on it. And when that happens, you can get a really skewed sense of who God is and who we are, because then you got to go to church. And if you're going to go to church, then you can leave church. Not only leave church for a week, but you could leave church. And then what does that mean? Oh, no, he left church, so we got to keep everybody in the church. And so this religious environment's like we got to keep everybody in the church. So it's like we got to have turrets with guards up in there with guns and put up barbed wire around the perimeter and make sure nobody ever escapes from the church. And if they do, then they may have to dig underground and run as fast as they can and hope they don't get shot on the back on the way out. And then we wonder why they're so bitter and angry when they do get away. This is just real estate, guys. I'm not making light of it, but I want you, it's real estate, and it's all rubble. As long as when we get to use it and meet in places, is cool. And gather together, that's sweet. And I'm happy to rejoice in it and be glad in it and rejoice in it. But like these monuments, like we're creating a whole other thing. And that legalism kills responsibility. They had the thought that as long as they obeyed the letter of the law, not the heart, that they weren't responsible for anything else. And what was happening here is like the worst to sin here is denying love. And so you can kind of see it when we drift into this legalistic kind of mindset. We look for the rule breakers. We even think about major moral failure. Usually, like when we think about that in regards to the family of God and religion, we would say, okay, major moral failure, sexual sin, major moral failure. Stealing, financial crimes, major moral failure. Abuse of power, major moral failure. But we already missed the first and greatest major moral failure. A lack of love. By the way, that's where it always starts. We don't need legalism to determine if we're on track. What we need is fruit, good fruit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. These are the things that we want to look for. We look for the evidence of God's Spirit and what He's doing. And so Jesus does a wicked turntable moment where He helps us understand that, unlike religion, Jesus came to include, not exclude. He came to invite all people from all places, from all kinds of backgrounds and experiences, who have done all kinds of things and had all kinds of things done to them. And so verse 52 says, "Woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering." When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with many questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. This is the nature of what religion does. It's trying to catch everyone. It's out there laying traps and looking for every misstep and everything else. And what Jesus is doing is saying, man, I've come to make a way for all people. And to invite people in to the family of God who others would have clearly rejected. I mean, they looked at Jesus and they were so shocked by the things he didn't do. He didn't wash his hands the right way. And when religion comes in, it just chokes out all that life and it excludes. And what Jesus is saying is no, I'm making a way for everyone. And He is our glorious way. And so I want you to know that God is indeed for you. And Jesus is indeed your way to be with Him forever. And we find this through His grace, His forgiveness, express to you when Jesus took your sin, all the things you've done and all the things done to you, and he put it to death in his body on the cross. And when he was dead and that sin died with him, he was buried. And on the third day he rose again, conquering my sin and my death, conquering your sin and your death, and putting it to rest once and for all, so that now we can rest from all that work of trying to do it on our own, and receive this gift of grace. And so when we share in a time of communion, not only do we remember, but it's a way that we can actively say yes. And so if you're having communion today and you have some bread, when we take that bread, we're saying yes to the wonderful way that Jesus has made. And even if you don't have bread right now, you can just say to him, yes, Jesus, I need you. Would you say that? Yes, Jesus, I need you. Jesus took bread and broke it. And he offered it to his friends and he said, take, eat, all of you. This is exactly what you need. He is our source of salvation, our source of life. Receive Jesus in his grace. And when we take of the cup, we're celebrating a new relationship that he gives us, where we acknowledge that he is Lord. He is in control. He is the one who defines me. And so when we drink to not just any king, but the King of Kings, to the King. I hope you'll spend a few moments right now aligning your heart with God's grace and allowing him to cleanse us from the inside, and trusting that that will then manifest outwardly, and as we begin to think like Jesus, talk like Jesus, act like Jesus. Pray a blessing over us. Father, help us to receive every good thing you have for us. Thank you for the new identity you give us. Transform us from the inside out. And we thank you that your grace is sufficient. And right now in this moment, we rely on your grace.